The special report on presidential power, its limits, as Donald Trump tests the executive branch's power, going farther than his own controversial first term. Indeed, he harkens back to presidents who had court clashes over bigger things like wartime powers or when the president may act alone. What wartime leaders like Roosevelt and Truman viewed as a last resort, though, carefully weighed with their experts, with their lawyers, and the nonpartisan civil service that they respected, well, in contrast to that, President Trump has just been rushing towards a first plan without any of those efforts to push these powers. Sometimes even when flatly banned by the Constitution, sometimes in ways that his own officials have said is reckless, and when warned by his own aides that he could still lose, and even when it invites a string of losses that he's been facing in these first 7 weeks, including new setbacks and losses in court this week alone. We can show you that on our tracker. Not a single win this week, and largely a losing record over the past several weeks. This is all driven by a strategy that you might call Sharpie first. Sign it and see what you can get away with. And that's actually partly different from Trump's first term when he pushed some orders that were knocked down in the courts. You might remember that. But I want to be clear, and I'm going to walk this through with you on our special report right now. Many things that he did do also followed past norms. Simple example, exit a climate accord. Presidents could do that, just as Biden, after his election, rejoined that same climate accord. That's valid. But this term, President Trump has picked a different strategy. For starters, there's the volume you might have noticed, doubling the orders from his first term. He's rushed out an unusually high 89 executive orders, signing more in the first 10 days than any recent president did in their first 100 days.
President Trump has reshaped the government with a flurry of executive orders.
All we have to do is flood the zone.
He has just signed a number of these executive orders.
Just overwhelmed the opposition.
The flurry of executive orders has been head-spinning.
It has been an unprecedented situation to have dozens and dozens of executive orders within the first week.
They'll bite on one and we'll get all of our stuff done. Bang, bang, bang. These guys will never be able to recover.
The initial rush could seem overwhelming to track, but that doesn't mean there's no way to ever, quote, recover, as Trump campaign vet and convict Steve Bannon argued there. Especially if many of these orders ultimately fail to stay on the books, if they just lose in court. So the legal history is instructive. Donald Trump likes to argue that he is a unique disruptor. And there's something funny I've mentioned to you before if you watch this program. His critics sometimes strike a similar note. They make Trump sound like every single thing he does in government is unprecedented or that extreme. But the history is more layered. Trump is pushing limits. He is breaking ground with some orders that are flatly illegal under current precedent, while in both parties, most presidents have avoided that out of respect for the rule of law, sometimes out of a general idea that getting knocked back a bunch early in your term wastes capital and time. But as mentioned, there have also been these intense times in history where presidents did try to do more with executive power. Take those wartime eras that I briefly mentioned, where you had bold government and you certainly had more public unity across America. Note the comparison here. Only Presidents Truman and FDR come close on total orders. Truman with 52 in those first 100 days and FDR with over 90. It depends slightly on how you count executive actions in that era. But they were combating existential threats from World War II and then its aftermath, which of course came after a punishing depression. FDR famously wielding his powers and taking on bankers to try to rewrite labor and business law basically on the fly. He also tried to change the Supreme Court itself with a court packing plan, which not even Trump has tried, by the way, or perhaps yet. And Truman, a veteran, tested using those war powers like FDR to take control completely of domestic businesses. Again, testing what the courts would do while also trying to reform the military.
The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. I shall ask the Congress for the one remaining instrument to meet the crisis. Broad executive power to wage a war against the emergency.
I and so many other men and women of color who have served this nation in uniform owes so much to President Harry S. Truman. He used an executive order. Why not a law? Because you could not have gotten a law passed in the Congress of the United States in 1948.
Colin Powell speaking about it personally. He's someone who, of course, served his country in many roles. And you heard the rationale there. Sometimes you test and push the power. You know Congress won't give it to you. So you see if it's lawful. In that case, talking about Truman integrating the military, what many see as a high point. It's a long ways from that kind of power and pushing boundaries for those kind of goals to what Trump is doing in the current strategy.
Back with me, Vaughn Hilliard, Mary McCord, Sky Perryman, and George Conway. All right, I want you to play this out for me two different ways. What happens if there are folks inside DOJ who are willing to carry his water as he dictated today? And what happens if people just leave en masse?
Well, I think first of all, there already have been dozens and dozens who have left. The civil division, as of I think a week ago, was down 30% and is probably down more. There will be people who see opportunity. Of course there will. I mean, it's a big place with a lot of attorneys, and some will say this is my ticket, but there's peril that comes with this, because I think will be an accounting someday for lawyers who violated their ethical obligations and the rules of professional responsibility. And many of the things that Trump was promising today that his attorneys, not the United States' attorneys, but his attorneys would violate those professional responsibilities. A lot of things that people are having to argue in court right now, because I think they've been told by the administration what to argue, are skating close to the line because they are objectively don't appear to be fact-based. I mean, I understand when you're saying, Elon Musk has no authority, that's what you're being told to say. But again, I'm going to come back to we're not stupid. We can see what's actually happening. And that's why you've seen judges like Judge Alsup yesterday saying this is a sham.
And I say strategy based on the evidence. This is not just some legal blundering into a bunch of court losses. These aren't just mere PR tactics like so many Trump antics. This is not, based on what we know, just some executive order version of hulking out. And by the way, it's not just overwhelming everyone like Steve Bannon said. Remember, Bannon ran the winning 2016 campaign. He's strategic enough to know you don't announce the entire playbook while you're running the plays against the other team. And so let me show you what our reporting suggests about this strategy right now. This Trump executive order playbook is one, the rush of orders. Some standard, like I mentioned, some very questionable, and many likely flatly unlawful under the current precedents. That's one. Two, and this is different, lean into these court challenges and fast track your appeals. The Trump administration has now been asking judges over these past 7 weeks to do something most administrations do not do. Take the cases, rush the answers. Basically, they want this fight. They've been filing these emergency appeals, which I'll talk about more in a moment. Anything to speed up the cases that are, remember, challenging whether Trump even has these powers under executive orders. It's the opposite of Trump's entire legal strategy over the previous 4 years in his own criminal cases, where he tried to run out the clock and asked for more time and then got the Supreme Court to delay the biggest trial he faced so much that it didn't happen by the election. If you're hearing my voice, you probably follow the news. You probably remember that, all the delays. And some of his supporters said it's only fair. These were unprecedented cases. Many critics said it was a kind of cynical tactic to run out the clock, but certainly you remember the delay, right? Well, now they've gone from delay to a sprint, often welcoming. What we can show you are now over 100 legal challenges to many of those executive orders written by Trump to try to seize powers that are so extensive that often they're ripe for suing.
With more on this, Kevin, walk us through what the judge said here.
Yeah, and you do see the legal machinery working very quickly after the president signed this proclamation. Only a few hours ago, the judge had already blocked its use from deporting 5 specific migrants that the administration had been targeting. What he has done now is expanded that to include all undocumented undocumented migrants who are being held in custody for whom this proclamation could apply. And he said that it was necessary to move very quickly here because, according to the plaintiffs in this case, some of the planes had already been loaded and ready to go to deport these people outside of the United States. And so this is on hold now for 14 days, and a hearing has been scheduled for later this month. But what this act would do, it's the Alien Enemies Act of 1798. It's a centuries-old law that would give the president sweeping authority to deport certain undocumented migrants. It's meant to be used during wartime. What President Trump says he wants to use it for is to deport migrants were associated with the Venezuelan gang Tren de Aragua. This law has only been used 3 times previously, during the World Wars and during the Japanese internment era during World War II. And I think it all comes against this backdrop inside the White House of frustrations on the part of the president and on the part of some of his advisors that the deportations he promised as a candidate are not happening quickly enough. And this law certainly would have allowed for sweeping authority to begin those deportations very quickly. But like so many else of the president's orders, it has now been blocked by a court, and it will move through the court system as the president and the Justice Department plan to appeal.
President Trump's actions during his time in office have raised serious questions about the limits of executive power and the fundamental principles of governance in a democracy. His willingness to push the boundaries of what is constitutionally permissible has resulted in a pattern of impulsive decision-making, frequent clashes with the judiciary, and an ongoing attempt to consolidate power within the executive branch. Unlike past presidents who exercised executive power with careful consideration and respect for the rule of law, Trump has often acted with little regard for the long-term consequences of his actions. Trump's approach to governance has been marked by an aggressive use of executive orders, many of which have faced immediate legal challenges. He has signed more executive orders in his first few weeks than any president in modern history, a strategy designed to overwhelm the opposition and push through his agenda quickly. While this may seem like an efficient use of presidential power, it often disregards the checks and balances that are essential to a functioning democracy. These executive orders, many of which have been deemed unconstitutional by courts, represent an attempt to bypass the legislative process and the will of the people. The history of American presidents using executive power is not without precedent. Leaders like Franklin D. Roosevelt and Harry S. Truman wielded significant authority during times of national crisis, such as World War II. However, their actions were always weighed carefully with the advice of experts, lawyers, and the nonpartisan civil service. Trump, in contrast, has shown a complete disregard for these established norms, acting impulsively and without the necessary foresight or expertise. His reliance on executive orders to push through policies that would otherwise face opposition in Congress is not only reckless, but dangerous. It sets a dangerous precedent for future presidents who may attempt to further consolidate power in the executive branch, undermining the democratic institutions that have long ensured a system of checks and balances. Trump's ongoing clashes with the judiciary further highlight the dangers of his approach. Over the past few weeks, Trump has suffered a string of legal defeats, with several of his executive orders being blocked by courts. These losses underscore the limits of presidential power and the importance of the judiciary in holding the executive accountable. Yet, instead of respecting these rulings, Trump has doubled down, filing emergency appeals to fast-track his cases and rushing to implement policies without proper legal review. This approach undermines the rule of law and further erodes trust in the institutions that are supposed to serve as checks on presidential power. While Trump may argue that he is a disruptor breaking with tradition to implement his agenda, his actions reveal a deeper disregard for the Constitution and the democratic process. His aggressive use of executive power is not a sign of strength, but a sign of weakness. It reflects a president who is unwilling to engage in the difficult work of negotiation and compromise with Congress, opting instead for unilateral action. This undermines the very foundations of American democracy and sets a dangerous precedent for future administrations. The legal challenges to Trump's executive orders are not just about technicalities. They represent a broader struggle over the role of the presidency in American governance. Trump's actions have raised important questions about the balance of power between the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. If the president is allowed to bypass the legislative process and make sweeping decisions through executive orders, the separation of powers that underpins the U.S. Constitution will be in jeopardy. Furthermore, Trump's disregard for the rule of law is not limited to his executive actions. His attempts to undermine the judiciary, attack the media, and erode public trust in democratic institutions reflect a broader strategy to consolidate power in the executive branch. This strategy is not about governance or policy. It is about control. Trump's actions threaten the very principles that have made the United States a beacon of democracy around the world. The judiciary's role in checking executive power is critical, and it has been reassuring to see the courts step in to block many of Trump's most egregious actions. These legal challenges serve as a reminder that no one, not even the president, is above the law. The courts have been forced to make swift and decisive rulings to stop the chaos created by Trump's executive orders, demonstrating that the rule of law still holds weight in America. However, the fact that the courts have been forced to intervene so frequently raises serious concerns about the state of American democracy. Looking ahead, the question is whether the American people will continue to allow this erosion of democratic norms. Trump's actions have shown that he is willing to push the limits of executive power at any cost, even if it undermines the very institutions that are supposed to hold him accountable. The damage caused by his presidency will take time to repair, but it is essential that the American people demand a return to respect for the rule of law and the principles of democracy. In the end, Trump's belief that he is above the law has been consistently challenged. The courts have made it clear that no president is above the Constitution, and the rule of law will always have the final say. While Trump may continue to test the limits of presidential power, the American people must remain vigilant in protecting the democratic institutions that have served the country for over 2 centuries. The future of American democracy depends on the ability of the people and the courts to hold leaders accountable and ensure that the president remains subject to the law.